Wendy and I wrote a chapter on social dreaming, the visual arts, and climate change. And it speaks to some of the things that Wendy and Paul were talking about as a definition of the psychosocial or climate psychology, in that we were interested in how the use of images in art and the use of images in social dreaming could help us to understand something about climate change which otherwise would be unthought. It speaks to Christopher Bolas's idea of the unthought known, which is something that's often quoted in relation to social dreaming. The idea being that we all know about climate change, and we all know about the disasters that are upon us, but those known things have yet to be properly thought out. What we did is we arranged a meeting of activists and artists in a farm in Devon. We asked our artists to bring some artworks to the site. The people who were going to participate in the social dreaming the next day were asked to view and to experience and interchange with the artworks the evening before, and the following morning we had a social dreaming session. And in that session, we believe, and we bring out in this chapter, that the ability to bring the unknown into thought via a combination of the images from the artworks and the images that emerged from the dreams and were expressed in the social dreaming matrix brought out, if you like, a deeper understanding, a way of bringing out feelings and thoughts which would not normally be expressed in if you like, cognitive dialogue. Not only that, within the images that were brought out, and within those images that were combined and interweaved with the images from the artworks, what was brought out was a lot of affective knowledge, which is also knowledge, which maybe is precisely the kind of knowledge that prevents us from understanding or thinking or wanting to talk about climate change. Knowledge such as grief, mourning, despair, frustration, and so on, brought out through images laden with affect. We also theorized that this collage of images and affect that is brought out by social dreaming and the experience of the artworks is connected to the idea, Timothy Morton's idea of the so-called hyper-object. So Timothy Morton talks about how climate change is an example of a hyper-object. That is to say, it is a massive collection of scientific facts that is so fragmented and yet so infinite that we cannot conceive of it. Our minds cannot grasp the meaning of the hyperobject. And I think that we demonstrate through the chapter that maybe if we shift our way of thinking and feeling through art, through social dreaming, maybe this is a way of expressing and therefore understanding the hyperobject that is climate change. And if we can understand the hyperobject, then we're on the way to being committed to action and thinking freely about these topics. So it begins, the Matrix begins with a wonderful dream, which Gordon Lawrence, the inventor of social dreaming, would have called the most important dream of the Matrix is the first dream, because the first dream provides, if you like, in Lawrence's language, a fractal of the next dreams that follow. And in that dream, we have the figure of Great Aunt Vera. And Great Aunt Vera is lost. We can't find Great Aunt Vera. She's gone off driving somewhere. We go to the post office in the local village to ask if they know where Great Aunt Vera is, and she can't be found. But someone says, yes, she's gone on the river with in a boat on a river, and is powered by an inflatable snowman. Who somehow has, there's a sort of technique by which the inflatable snowman manages to move the boat along the river. And I think that that's an example of how a dream can express so many things in a little memorable story that is engaging. So you engage with this story because it's so curious and interesting, and within it you have the greatness of the person who is part of the story, Great Aunt Vera. You have the connection with the family, she's the aunt. You have in the name Vera possibly the idea of truth, so you have a figure who becomes the truth teller. A way is found in the dream to prevent her from driving, which is not just a dangerous thing for Great Aunt Vera to do, but of course it produces carbon emissions. So the dream says, look, we're going to prevent this happening. We're going to find a way of re-communicating with each other. We're going to go to the local post office. The post office is a symbol of where things are exchanged and communicated, and local knowledge, local community knowledge can be used to help us move on. And the news from the local knowledge is that Great Aunt Vera has somehow found this marvelous ecological solution to move on by moving this, getting the snowman, who's an inflatable snowman, to somehow with his air or something, or and the snowman, of course, some symbol of a way of solving climate change symbolically is you don't have a real snowman, you have an inflatable snowman, and this snowman is somehow working in an ecological and clean energy fashion the boat along the river. So it talks to us about understanding our elders, valuing local communication, finding solutions out of the box, and so on. And as the matrix moves on, and this is the interesting thing about the way dreams come together, and the art exhibition came together with the dreams, as the matrix moves on, that single dream becomes important in different parts of the matrix in a very highly complex way. So later on, there's a discussion about energy and how energy is something that is invisible but can be seen or felt somehow. So there's a reference to an artwork which is incorrectly defined as a carbon molecule, but the point is it's a highly magnified shot of something that you wouldn't normally see, a tiny thing that you wouldn't normally see. So it talks about what you can see and what you can't see, and how thinking or feeling through art can enable us to see what is not seen, just as climate change is something that you can hardly see. So the question is then, how can you bring out what you can't see? How can you bring out the known and make it seen? How can you bring out the known and make it thought? And the energy discussion in the matrix that emerges from that, which is an artwork, is combined with the first dream, to discuss the idea of energy and the ecological energy that drives the boat forwards for Great Aunt Vera. Theoretically, we also discuss the Deleuzean idea, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze, of the rhizome and intensities of affect, of emotion within a rhizomatic structure. We sort of imply or allude that to think of things rhizomatically as opposed to in a linear fashion, a cause and effect fashion, is in fact what we need for thinking about the climate and climate change, because everything is interconnected in the global perspective in ways which are difficult to understand, and if you linearize things, you lose track of how things are interconnected in a more rhizomatic or networked fashion. So we compare that theory with the idea of a hyperobject and the way that social dreaming was working among the participants. So the contribution, I think, is a contribution in terms of method, psychosocial method, and the messages, if you like, if there are messages here, are if we can try and think more affectively, if we can try and bring the known into a thinking, affective mode, if we can try and rid ourselves of linear thinking and think in a more rhizomatic, networked fashion, maybe there's hope, and we can move from Great Aunt Vera's ugly habits with her car to some magical propulsion on the waters.
Okay. Any again questions, thoughts, or reflections on what Julian has just said and social dreaming? Tessa?
Yeah, I was just struck by the idea of the hyper object, and it's been something that I've been thinking about how we actually can't sort of stare directly at the subject, and actually it was expressed very. I was at a Dark Mountain project a few weeks ago, and Dougal Hine talked about it. That he said he was talking about the subject as like the Medusa head, that that we can't stare at it directly because it will turn us to stone, but that we need a reflective practice like the mirror in the shield to be able to look at it and understand it and start to engage with it. So that was one of the things that really struck me about the hyper object and what social dreaming is, and actually a lot of artistic practice as well. And the other thing which I've talked to you before about, Julian, which is how similar to me social dreaming feels when I've been engaged with it. With the, it feels very, very similar and familiar, like the creative practice of artists coming together for the first time in a studio to start to create something. It is that sense of something, and something that kind of you come at it from a different angle, and you kind of mine that kind of rhizomatic sense of things that are just coming up to the surface.
I think it's two things strike me about that. I love the Medusa head kind of analogy. It really fits, doesn't it? But you know, it's fearsome to look directly at it. And the setting of social dreaming is built for containment. And there was a lot of stuff actually in that session that Julian was describing, which was talking about the safety of that containing space, the physical proximity and yet the mental space that people had to think about things which in everyday life they daren't think about. And people were really saying that, and it enabled some quite fearsome images as well as some kind of very left field images to come up, which were very creative and artistic. And so containment is an extremely important kind of principle which people achieve in different ways. And the other thing is the fact that it's not individuals contributing as individuals per se. The way it's psychosocial is that you kind of leave your ego outside the circle, so it's not a circle, it's a snowflake. Coming from psychoanalysis, there's no direct eye contact with anybody else because of the way the chairs are arranged. And so you're speaking into a shared space. It's almost like a cultural unconscious. And that's also very reassuring, because there's no individual that is having to perform in this group, and everybody is building something that you recognise through the associations, and it really is quite a transcendent experience in many ways, but it's safe, hence it's possible, I think. And so it's not just, we're not staring at Medusa just as individuals kind of head on with all the fears that arise as a result of that.
Just to add, the clip we didn't get to see from Sally in Australia is relevant to this, because Sally, her chapter is based on she's a Jungian therapist. She worked with a group of, she's also a climate activist, she worked with a group of activists in the Sydney area for a year, and they met together every month in a group, which was a kind of what you'd call a cooperative inquiry group, where as a group they were inquiring into their own ongoing experiences of being activists, engaging with climate change in Australia. And one of the things that started coming up in their regular meetings was their dreams. That's the connection. That's why I was going to have Sally and Julian talking together, because people were bringing their dreams of the environment and the changing nature of the environment in Australia and climate change into the group. And it's very interesting how it reminded us, it reminds us really that it is alive now in our dream life, climate change, for all of us, in all sorts of subtle ways. And I think it's very interesting, in my experience, and I don't know, it would be interesting to share other people's experience, those of you who were around during the period of the last great fear, which was the fear of the bomb, mutually assured destruction, late 70s and early 80s, the dreams punctuating people's lives then, I think, were rather different to the dreams that are coming through from climate change now. In some ways, certainly my own experience was they were far more apocalyptic. The number of times I was awoken in the middle of the night by atomic bombs going off in my dream life. Very different to my experience of how I'm dreaming about climate change. But they're there now, present, I think, in all of our dream lives, whether we remember them or not. And as a practicing psychotherapist, they're starting now to come into my consulting room as well. So, Helen.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been involved in social dreaming for a long time, and I used to do it a lot with a colleague at I'm also a Union analyst. We have a sort of international meet-up every 3 years, the International Association, and we started doing it there every day for the week of the conference. And it was like about 120 people would come to these social dreaming matrices at 8 o'clock. And I think what was also powerful about them is that they don't always necessarily find a solution, like Great Auntie Vera and but sometimes they symbolise something about the dilemma we're in and the relief that brings. I remember a dream very powerfully about 10 years ago now. Someone there was a dream that was about, she was standing in her kitchen ironing, and there was a volcano in the distance, and she could see the volcano was erupting, and knew this volcano was going to come and destroy everything. And she went on ironing, and this became a real image. Are we fiddling our own burns, or is all we can do is sort out our own creases and get things as straight as we can for ourselves? And the sort of both and nature of this was a huge relief in the room somewhere. So I think it's also powerful in expressing the dilemmas and the struggles as well as the finding solutions.
Yeah, that links with what I just had the question in my mind listening to everybody about what this means for the practice of psychotherapy. perhaps there needs to be another book.
Can't hear you very well at that.
Sorry, I was just wondering what this means for the practice of psychotherapy. How this might affect or change the way psychotherapists think about what they're doing or how they're working, and whether perhaps there needs to be another book on that subject. Further, having looked at the research and the findings, is there a way of bringing this into some sort of awakening, healing, some sort of practice that has a more that spreads outwards in a way? I don't know. Sorry, I can't even articulate quite my question, but maybe people can make a better job of it than I can.
Well, let's move on. And Joe, do you want to contribute now? Because Joe, I think your contribution is connected a little bit to where Sarah's just ended.
Could you just give the people's last names, because...
Yeah, sure. Okay, so Joe Hamilton. And that was Julian Manley.
Yeah, thank you. And before I start, I just also want to start by saying gratitude to, specifically Paul, Wendy, Sally, Renee and Ro, who kind of really laid the ground for some of the research that I'm doing. So I'm going to start by, giving that gratitude. And then I'm going to talk about my chapter. I'm going to summarise it in a haiku-ish, which came out yesterday. And this is kind of a found haiku by using the words of the people I've been interviewing. Turn towards climate, connecting, longing, grieving, frigging liberating. So those are the words that came out in the course of finishing up my PhD research on a whole range of different emotionally reflective methodologies, and that's what the subject of my chapter really explores, calls emotions, reflexivity and the long haul, what we do about how we feel about climate change. And so it's looking at a whole range of group work which enables acknowledgement through to expression and processing of some of the emotions that come up around climate change. These group works draws on psychology, indigenous wisdom, spiritualities, contemporary theory, group work, eco-psychology, a whole range of different strands. And some of the ones I've been particularly looking at are ones of the work that reconnects, or Act of Hope, which is Joanna Macy and colleagues over the last 30 to 40 years. Inner transition, so how reflective practices or forms of group work are integrated into movements for change, such as the transitional sustainability groups. Carbon conversations, which Ro has been pioneering about psychologically informed group work about climate change action. And also a project called the Carbon Literacy Project in Manchester, which is kind of spreading out quite widely, but aimed at delivering a day of carbon literacy, which doesn't sound that emotional, but people go on a whole roller coaster through the day, but that's really about delivering at scale. So over 1,000 people have been involved in the BBC, people involved in housing associations, people involved in city councils, and they're looking at rolling it out through governments as well. So, sort of local government. So this part of the research reflects interviews with facilitators on what they've observed from facilitating a whole range of being involved with these practices, and some of them are in the room, so thank you to you too as well. And so I just wanted to draw out some of those strands as well, because they seem to be places where those kind of double silences, the silence about climate change and the silence about how we feel about it and emotions in general, kind of really intersect. It's sort of, the chapter really summarises some of those themes that are coming through. The first one about creating the capacity to respond. And I think that really comes out in those tensions between agency and urgency. And what I was going to contribute earlier is about how do we create that safety and containment to enable those connections within ourselves, say, oh wow, gosh, I have emotions about this, I have feelings about this, and then between, it's like, oh, so do other people, and what a relief that we can share these and bring them into the room. And also beyond, so those connections and relating to the more than human world, however they're conceived. So I'm also doing research and trying to write up a whole range of interviews with participants, which uses a much more psychosocial approach as well, which is very, very rich. So I just want to read out a couple of quotes of what facilitators had observed. And this is from one facilitator who's offered practices in places like, anti-fracking camps or Occupy in London or at festivals. She just said, I just experienced how frigging liberating people find it to have a space to go, oh my God, this really hurts, this is really hard. I hadn't even realised that this has been in my system and I've just named this. Then they want to hear more in a way because they've got that honouring our pain, honouring our feelings is actually a healthy thing to do. And so some of the people that she was talking about were more about activists, about how we resource ourselves to be there for the long haul. How do we sustain action when there's so much that comes up, intergroup conflicts, frustrations, things going around in ways that we didn't expect or might disagree with as well. So it's about actually how we resource and sustain activism in lots of different spheres as well. And just about a part of that sustaining really sort of speaks to some of the themes that we're bringing up that were brought up earlier about, how do we do those connections? How do we make it safe to make those connections to the more than human world? Building relationships. And this is a facilitator recounts one participant's experience of, kind of a solo nature connection. She said, she said that this woman said, I spend all my time working in an NGO. I feel completely burnt out and I really believe in this, but I never sit in nature. And I just feel so completely nourished. And because I feel so given to, I want to give back. It's not that I should, but it's like being in a relationship. And I think it's about developing that relationship which can both contain all our feelings but also resource. And about that relationship of, another facilitator was saying actually the best workshops, she was talking specifically about Buddhist workshops, is like when you get to that state of, well, what can't help but happen? What flows through? And that's something I see coming out again and again as a theme. So, some themes coming out was, about how we build containment. Sometimes they're one-off workshops. What happens next? How do people find those sources of containment, those places and people that they can process this or develop a practice in an ongoing way? And those practices can be broad. They can be mindfulness, they can be nature connection, they can be places where people do a full-on grief ritual. That's something I'm sort of actively involved in thinking, okay, how do we make those connections? Because what was also very clear was for a whole range of methods that were about connection, they were very unconnected. They were very invisible, they were very beneath the radar. And it's about what connections are needed, at what scale, and also for what purpose. People were saying, well, it'd be great to have people with experience of trauma in the room when I do my workshops, because that's coming up again and again. How do we share between practices? And a lot of these practices are in very liminal spaces. They're not public, they're not private, they're somewhere in between. How do we do that in workplace contexts where vulnerability and professionalism really don't sit well together? What are the practices that enable that? So, I think I'll stop there. So those are the things that have been explored a bit within the chapter, and I'm sort of also writing up more in my PhD as well.
Thank you, Jo.
Thank you.
Questions, thoughts, Jo?
A thought in response. I've just recently been to two amazing events in terms of that power to unleash affect, unleash but channel somehow. I just wanted to mention them, or one I just mentioned to Wendy, which is I went to a reading group at the Psychosocial Studies Conference that recently took place. And this was an unexpected unfolding, because that sounds essentially quite dry, and let's read a text together. But assembling people around a text for an hour and a half turned out to be, in both the ones that I attended, an incredibly intense and evocative and affect-laden experience. And the other thing was yesterday. And yesterday I went to an event on restorative justice in